It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Vincent Bacote, professor of theology and director of the Center for Applied Christian Ethics at Wheaton College. Vince's publications are quite prolific. They include Reckoning with Race, America's Failure and the Future of Equality, Performing the Good News, In Search of a Better Evangelical Theology, and The Political Disciple, A Theology of Public Life. He has made contributions to volumes such as Cultural Engagement, A Crash Course in Contemporary Issues, and The Church's Social Responsibility, as well as Black Scholars in White Places. Well, the reason you're here, that we're all here, we live in an age when theology has become weaponized for political gain. Christian nationalism is a movement fed by several streams of what is known by various titles, including one called dominion theology, and that argue for a religious, social, and political takeover of various sectors of society. These theologies include the so-called Calvinist or Reformed Reconstructionism and the Seven Mountains Mandate of far-right evangelical and charismatic groups. This and more is the focus of our morning, and Vince is going to facilitate that and tell us some things that we really need to be thinking and praying about. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Vince Bacote.
Thank you, Quinn. It's great to be here, great to be invited. Thank you all for coming out on this brisk Saturday morning. I did not bring it with me from Chicago. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Christian nationalism piece and then talk about a better way. So first we need to define Christian nationalism, because people have been talking about the language a lot, but it's not really always clear what that means. So here's the simple version of what Christian nationalism is. It's a fusion of Christian identity with national identity, including the belief that the nation should be governed according to Christian beliefs. Another way I like to put it is to say that if you contrast nationalism with patriotism, patriotism puts your flag at the foot of the cross. Nationalism drapes your flag over the cross. That's kind of a way I like to think about it. So here's the complication when we talk about Christian nationalism. If you ask some people, are they a Christian nationalist, or if you ask them, is the United States a Christian nation, you'll have a lot of people that will say, yeah. So really, that question alone isn't going to get us to knowing whether we're dealing with a concerning form of nationalism or whether people are just talking about the fact that the United States has a lot of Judeo-Christian background. Here's one of the ways I like to emphasize that. If you asked Martin Luther King if we were a Christian nation, he would have said yes. It was one of the reasons for saying why we ought to pursue civil rights. So the question of being a Christian nation itself doesn't do enough work for us understanding that, whether a person is the kind of concerning Christian nationalist. There are two surveys recently. Ryan Burge has done some work, and then the Public Religion Research Institute has done some work that help us to get a better focus on this. So back in 2007, there was a survey done from Baylor that was dealing with the question of how much people wanted Christian influence in the United States. And Burge checked in 2024 to see what had changed since then. Here were the questions that the survey asked, and these are the kinds of questions that help us to see whether there's cause for concern. And so these are yes or no type questions. Number one, the federal government should advocate for Christian values. Yes or no, right? Number two, the federal government should allow prayer in public schools. Number 3, the federal government should allow the display of religious symbols in public spaces. Number 4, the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. Number 5, the federal government should enforce strict separation of church and state. Number 6, the success of the United States is part of God's plan. Here's some additional questions from the one with the Public Religion Research Institute. Yes or no? If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. Or that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Those are the kinds of questions that help us to see whether a person is really a Christian nationalist or not. So here's part of what Burge discovered. He discovered that actually since 2007, the number of people answering all those questions positively has actually declined overall in terms of the American populace. But he does make this observation. This will probably not surprise you. The share of Republicans who say that the government should declare the United States a Christian nation has risen by 5 points since 2007, from 40% to 45%. The share who say that the success of the United States is part of God's plan has jumped 13 points during this same time period, from 46 to 59%. So, with Republicans, at least some of these statements, more Republicans are saying particularly that the success of the United States is part of God's plan. That's been one of the big things that's gone up. But interestingly, for a lot of the other questions, it's actually declined. But of course, we are still hearing a lot about this language of Christian nationalism. So who exactly are the people that have the strongest commitments to what you might call a concerning version of Christian nationalism, and who are the weakest in terms of who has a rejection of those ideas? So there are people that you would call adherents. So these are people who firmly believe that the United States should be a Christian nation. There are sympathizers who generally agree with the core tenets of Christian nationalism, but with a lesser intensity. Skeptics are people who are wary of the ideology and mostly disagree with its goals. And then there are rejectors, people who completely oppose the fusion of church and state. So, in terms of the overall population, adherents is 10 to 11%. Sympathizers, 19 to 20%. Skeptics, 37%. Rejectors, 30%. So that's 67% of people that are saying this really concerns me. Right? That's a lot of the population. So it's important to keep that in mind when we're hearing about that, right? Because hearing things can sometimes exaggerate what we think the size of something is. But there are enough people who are talking about it for sure among the adherents and sympathizers. So, with the Public Religion Research Institute's survey, 55% of Republicans qualify as adherents or sympathizers, compared to 16% of Democrats. In terms of what parts of the country it's most concentrated, support is highest in parts of the Bible Belt. So 51% Mississippi, 51% Oklahoma, 50% Louisiana, showing the highest concentrations. So there are people who are saying this. Well, what are the things that they believe? Well, there's a range of views. You know, as Quinn mentioned, there's this Reformed version, it's kind of Presbyterian version, Christian Reconstructionism, and then there's this sort of neo-charismatic Seven Mountains movement. I want to start with the latter, say a little bit about the Christian Reconstruction piece, and then I'm going to mention something that is noisy but very small. And then I'll suggest another way. So, what about this Seven Mountains movement? Because sometimes I'm reading articles, people will say, well, you know what's behind all this, the Seven Mountains, etc. All right, so where did this come from? So in the middle of the 1970s, around 1975, there is a charismatic leader named, not charismatic as in like charismatic personality, charismatic as in theologically, tongues, prophecy, words of knowledge, that kind of thing, miracles, etc., named Loren Cunningham. Loren Cunningham was about to have a meeting with some other friends, other leaders, and he had this dream where God was telling him that there were these 7 areas of culture, and that Christian mission needed to disciple those areas of culture. One of the people who came to this meeting that he was at was Bill Bright, the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ. Bright told him that he'd had a similar dream about God wanting mission to go to those 7 areas and to shape or influence those areas. Now, here's the important thing to understand. Okay, that's 1975. Most people are not hearing anything about 7 mountains until maybe the last decade. So the language of 7 mountains is not new. It's not new. And if you think mainly about Campus Crusade for Christ, Christian nationalism is not the first thing you're probably thinking about. Right now, you may have questions about their methodologies for doing evangelism, etc., but you're not mainly thinking about, okay, when I think about Christian nationalism, I think Bill Bright's the founder of it. The point being that neither Loren Cunningham nor Bill Bright were mainly thinking about taking over the universe. They were thinking about, if you will, saving the world for Jesus. And so they have this 7 mountains language. They definitely used it. And it's very missiological for them. So here's something you can do to check this out. So Loren Cunningham is over, helped found this organization called Youth with a Mission, YWAM, they call it. So if you look up YWAM's website, you'll definitely find out something about the 7 mountains or 7 spheres of culture there. But it's interesting when you look at the language there. The language is very much talking about discipling the nations and definitely changing things, definitely having influence. But it's very clear that the intent for them is more, we want to change people's lives. Right? In other words, you don't have the kind of a militant tone, really. All right? So this is important. I just want to mention that because, again, sometimes when people will say, well, it's the 7 mountains idea, etc. However we want to talk about it, it's important that we talk about it and we know what dimension of it we're talking about. All right? Just like we would want people to, get our story straight, we want to get that story straight. And so the question is, first of all, what are the 7 mountains? Let's talk about what that is, and then I will talk about where concern is indeed more warranted. You may have concern about already what their plan was, but there's more concern ahead. So, here are the 7 spheres: religion, family, government, education, media/arts, entertainment, and business. So, they call them 7 spheres or mountains of culture. For them, again, discipleship of the nations. Well, when does it become more of that? Well, this is where we introduce another figure. A figure named Peter Wagner, who's a missiologist. And known for lots of different things about church growth, etc. I knew him more as a controversial church growth person before this piece. So he was definitely a part of charismatic renewal type stuff. And here's the important thing. In 2001, Peter Wagner said that we were entering a new apostolic age. And so what did he mean? He says the term for the new wineskin that God's provided for these churches, he's talking about the global spread of charismatic Christianity. So the African independent churches, Chinese house churches, Latin American grassroots churches, and U.S. independent charismatic churches is the new apostolic reformation. It is a reformation because we are currently witnessing the most radical change in the way of doing church since the Protestant Reformation. is apostolic because of the recognition of the gift and office of apostle. That's the most radical in the whole list in this new wineskin. It's new to distinguish it from older traditional church groups that have incorporated the term apostolic into their official name. And so when he's talking about apostolic, he is talking about, in some Pentecostal and charismatic settings, they'll say that the office of the apostle, so these are people whose role it is to obviously have jurisdiction. It's not just that they have jurisdiction, they're also people, because remember this is a charismatic tradition, that they are people who receive revelation from God. And particularly revelation from God, not just in terms of particular, hey, God, thus saith the Lord, but also new interpretations of things in Scripture. And so Wagner says more. This is where the Seven Mountains piece comes in. He says, the starting point is to recognize that what many of us have been calling the Seven Mountains, which are the supreme molders of culture, religion, family, education, media, government, arts, entertainment, and business. For a society to change, each one of the seven mountains needs to be influenced or dominated by persons of goodwill. Now, I realize you're questioning that part. But influenced or dominated by persons of goodwill, whether Christians or non-Christians, this is a positive way of looking at dominionism. Now, what's not new about what he says there is that what people call dominion theology existed prior to 2001. Dominion theology is language that some charismatics would use to say something like this. So, God creates the world goes awry, it's under the domain of Satan, Jesus comes, Jesus died, Jesus resurrected, Jesus conquered Satan, Pentecost comes. What does that mean for Christians? Because Jesus has conquered Satan and Pentecost comes, and now what does it mean for Christians filled with the Spirit? It means now what was Satan's domain is now Jesus has taken that back, and it's up for Christians to reclaim that and practice that, and to have God empower them to take back from Satan what he had as his domain, which of course is like all the world, right? And so who are the people that are leading this? Apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, evangelists, etc. And so the people who are doing this, then they're thinking about this as a kind of spiritual warfare that extends not just what people are doing in worship, but in this case, extending to having people that show up in every domain of culture. And this is also, I think, where a big shift takes place. If you're talking to Bright or Cunningham, they're talking about influencing those domains. If you're talking to Wagner, they're definitely talking about dominion. Definitely talking about dominion. And dominion in a way that is going along with the prior charismatics. Like there's a guy named Joseph Morecraft, created like Christian schools and things out of Georgia. So he's in the 1980s talking about dominion theology. But now you're having Wagner update this. And so Wagner becomes really kind of the figurehead who influences some other names that I'm going to mention in a moment. Now, one of the things you may be wondering is, okay, so I've told you about this kind of these theological ideas. Are there particular biblical texts that are significant for them? So here are important verses. This will not surprise you. Genesis 1:28, God's command for humanity to have dominion, which is applied to taking cultural influence. Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of mountains. So that's seen as a prophecy of God's kingdom rising above worldly systems. Matthew 28, 18-20, the Great Commission. Make disciples of all nations means what? Extending to discipling nations through cultural figures. But that discipling, of course, is not just changing people's lives. It's changing all of these spheres of culture or these mountains of culture. Okay, and here's where there's a particular seven mountains interpretation. Revelation 17:9. Here's what the mind has wisdom. The seven heads are seven mountains. So it's talking about, that's Rome is talking about. But it's interpreted as symbolic of the ruling powers that Christians should influence. So that's an example of saying, well, here's what that verse means. So we see what those seven mountains are. oh, you know what those 7 mountains are. It doesn't matter what it meant to the first readers of Revelation. What matters is that now, oh, those are the 7 mountains of culture. Now, even though it says that, there's nothing in that text actually about what you're supposed to do about those 7 mountains. But that's what is interpreted. So those are 4 of the prominent verses. And for them, again, thinking about Wagner's influence, he's saying with this new era that's happening, 2001, God's restoring apostles and prophets of churches. And of course, and this is what makes it tricky. If there are people who are the apostles, and they're the people who are getting this particular revelation, which may be particular words, but was more about specific ways of interpreting text, it's a tricky thing to say, okay, here's why I think you're wrong. Because if you're the apostle, hey, I'm the person who gets the revelation. So I'm not the person that you can question. Right? So that's what makes it problematic. Now, Wagner is very instrumental in this, but the people who have probably been most instrumental in making it spread, probably the biggest name is a guy named Lance Wallnau, Wallnau. And he says about the 7 mountains piece, he says, I started popularizing this image around the year 2000 because the Bible uses mountains as a metaphor for world kingdoms. It seemed we lacked a template in the world to grasp what shapes a nation and how to bring the kingdom into people's lives. Now, when he's saying that, of course, he's not just thinking about, quote unquote, changing people's lives. I think he generally wants to change people's lives, but clearly it also means, if you will, taking over those 7 mountains. And so he's the person, for example, that said that, if you've heard people talk about, hey, someone said that Donald Trump was like a Cyrus figure from Isaiah, so somebody that God raises up to have, to help make things deliver for us. So he's the person that said that, and he said that prior to 2016. So he's, in some ways, one of the biggest figures in leading all of this. Another person to look up is a guy named Dutch Sheets. He's another person who's very active in all of this. Sidney Jacobs is another name associated with this. Now, here's part of the problem about New Apostolic Reformation. So it's this thing called New Apostolic Reformation, but it's not a denomination. And it's not even really like an organization that has these big conferences where they get together and say, hey, let's do New Apostolic Reformation things. It winds up being a loose network of people that are all having similar commitments. And a good place to see one of those commitments, for example, is look up, if you want to, it's called Wagner Theological University. Named after Peter Wagner. Founded by Peter Wagner, I think. Peter Wagner's been deceased since 2016, but you will see at that institution clearly emphasis on the 7 mountains. Right? But here, okay, so you've got that institution, but that doesn't mean that every 7 mountains person or every New Apostolic Reformation person like goes to that school for training. Right? It's one expression of ways that people are doing that. So there's all kinds of ways that are happening. How many of you have heard of Bethel Church in Redding, California? That's certainly one of the biggest places. And so, one of the big things that they're associated with is contemporary worship music. And at least for some of that, one of the ways that they talk about doing the changing is by, okay, hey, we need to be fighting these battles in worship. And everybody's supposed to be, worshiping and getting certain kind of revelations about and praying for God to make certain things happening. Now, you might be thinking, well, how exactly does that work? So here's something maybe you guys remember. In the 2020 election, when it began to be clear that Biden was probably going to win this, how many of you remember people showing a video of Paula White at her church praying, and she was like talking about calling for, angels from Africa, etc. Well, so that's like a spiritual warfare type of language connected to political realities. And that's kind of an example of sort of the way that people are connecting prayer and worship to being part of how you're making these changes happen. Because it's thought, again, if you're taking back this domain from Satan, so there's these unseen battles that are happening, how are you engaging those unseen battles? So that's a lot of how they're talking about things changing. Of course, there's rhetoric about taking back Satan's territory. There's rhetoric about needing to change the world or take over the world. But sometimes it's so connected to just talking about changing the world and changing people's lives that it's very possible that a lot of the people who are, if you will, the lay people in this, they may not even know what New Apostolic Reformation language means. And they might think, well, I just want to spread the gospel to the world. And as I understand it, it means that, we're on the other side of the resurrection and Pentecost, and, God said eventually everything's going to be under his reign, and he's given us this work to do. Which makes it a tricky enterprise. It's also a tricky enterprise, by the way, for people who are within it, because so much of it depends upon language about getting revelation and feeling. And sometimes, every tradition has their hazards. A hazard of Pentecostal and charismatic traditions is if people believe in words of knowledge or prophecies, etc., pressure to get a word, right? Pressure to be having a particular kind of experience. So all of that's also going on in those domains. And so the big thing I would say is be concerned about the leaders. Don't be concerned about the people under the leaders, but it's a challenge because of its loose affiliations. It's also because not everybody who uses Seven Mountains language uses militant language. Some do, some don't. You've got to look at it case by case. Be concerned? Absolutely. In fact, and here's one other reason to be concerned, especially if we're talking about Reformed theology. The view of God and God's control over the future is a very more open view of providence. In other words, God, yes, he has a plan. He has a long-term plan, but much is undetermined. In other words, and you need this to be undetermined because if you're doing all this prayer and this spiritual battle, you're in the battle, it's like, well, when's the outcome going to land? Well, it's up for grabs, right? So it's what people call a more open view of the future rather than a view of the future where God has a plan that will, it's mysterious, but he has a plan that will unfold. It's certainly in the New Apostolic Reformation, there's a much more open view of that. So, which means there's more, if you will, responsibility or pressure on us to be making the future happen. Right? So that's also definitely present in this. Now, here's an interesting connection to think about. And maybe some of you are wondering about this connection. Is there a connection between Charlie Kirk and all of this? Sort of. And here's what I mean. It's true that he met Lance Wallnau. It's true that Lance Wallnau said that he was sort of like this young, emerging leader. It's true that Charlie Kirk certainly was exposed to this Seven Mountains language. But here's what's interesting. I'm not saying you need to do this, but if you want to do this. If you go over to Turning Point USA and you look at the language there, you do not find Seven Mountains language there. You will see that there is a desire for using education, using politics, using religion to recover America or take back America. You'll see that. But you don't specifically see the Seven Mountains type of language. I mean, is it a kind of Christian nationalism? Yes, absolutely. But you don't see it in the way that you can go to literally sevenmountains.com and you can see things. Okay, you go to Turning Point's website, you don't see that specific language. So there's a relationship, but It's not all clear that Charlie Kirk thought about himself as like a charismatic Seven Mountains kind of person. He did think about himself as a person who was trying to take back America. But a lot of his discourse sounds more like what you would call classic religious right type stuff, certain kinds of conservative politics stuff that he's talking about. Hey, we want to teach our kids to be Americans who care about free markets, personal liberty, all those types of things. And doing it from schooling through, obviously, college rallies. And by schooling, by the way, I mean like Turning Point Academies, classical schools all over the country. And maybe that's part of what Wallnau is talking about. You've got somebody who's organizationally trying to say, how do I penetrate all this? And so maybe that's why he was thinking Kirk is the guy, because he's got this organization that's spreading in all of these places. And so, hey, here's maybe a way for it to happen. So, I mean, that's the closest connection that I observe with that. No question about Kirk being a nationalist, but whether being explicitly Seven Mountains, I think that is more fuzzy, more hazy. You might say, I see the Seven Mountain stuff there. You probably do, but not necessarily that discourse. So, big picture, the Seven Mountains, way of thinking about Seven Mountains is if you think about the commitment to missions in Matthew 28, which is there, it's like running it through a distortion field that turns it to not just changing people's lives and having some effect on the world around them, but it being on Christians to establish God's kingdom. And you're doing it through some varying versions of charismatic Christianity. That's the way to think about that. So that's the Seven Mountains piece. I said I would say something about the Christian Reconstruction side. So what's called Christian Reconstructionism or theonomy, it precedes Douglas Wilson, but I'm going to mention him. It's basically what emerges in certain contexts of Presbyterianism, where the way of thinking about how the kingdom comes about is through a version of what's called post-millennial theology. Revelation chapter 20, the language of the millennium, which is when Satan is bound. How do you get the millennium? Does Jesus return before the millennium or after the millennium? People who are called post-millennialists are people who say there's a lot of stuff that we have to do to put the kingdom in place, and Jesus will not come back until that happens. And so Christian Reconstructionism is a version of postmillennialism that includes, hence the language of Reconstruction, talking about running society according to the Bible. Certainly, probably the most prominent person who fits that now, or at least in terms of the person getting airtime, is Doug Wilson. And so I invite you to think, again, if you want to look at the interview he did with Ross Douthat in the New York Times, because he kind of explained his view there. And here's something that's very different about Wilson from what I was just talking about with Seven Mountains. The Seven Mountains view, there's a particular urgency, and if you're talking about the spiritual battle language, there's this idea about trying to make stuff happen. Now, Wilson is definitely a planner and wants to make stuff happen. But it's very clear he's talking about a very long game. And he wants society to, if you're going to say, okay, what's sort of a way to frame it, is for our laws to be emerging out of the Ten Commandments and implications thereof. Now, when it comes to the actual philosophy of how our republic is supposed to be like, he's not just using biblical language. Right? He calls himself a kind of libertarian, for example. The Bible doesn't say anything about libertarians. So it's not strictly just from the Bible. But certainly when it comes to the laws, he wants society to be ordered according to laws that are some kind of expression from the Ten Commandments. And he's written a lot. He has certain kind of online presence. There's church planting that goes on out of his denomination. But relative to the Seven Mountains, much smaller. Right? If you're in certain circles, yes, he gets a lot of attention. In other places, people are like, Doug Wilson, I'm not sure I've heard of him. But he's important to know, and maybe you've heard of it, because one of his churches from his denomination, our current, Secretary of, the Department of War, it's called now. Right? He goes to a church out of that denomination. But it's a much slower ebb type of postmillennialism than what you're seeing with the Seven Mountains language. But there's definitely strategy. But it's committed to saying God gave humans the responsibility to put the kingdom in place. He's not coming back until we do. That's what you have to be saying if you're a postmillennialist. Now, open parenthesis. The dominant eschatology prior to the Civil War was postmillennialism. Now, a civil war will devastate that optimism. And the view there was basically that, now, of course, it was only thinking about what was happening with the revivalism in the United States. But with the counter-revivalism that was happening, there are people who were wondering, will there be this glorious appearing of Jesus? Because are you going to get the gospel preached to every creature, and then the end will come? So it was more about conversion than about changing everything in society, although it did fuel some of the social activism. Right? Because of the social activism being ways of putting the ways of God in place, temperance unions, for example. But that postmillennialism is very different from the postmillennialism associated with Wilson. So, what do we do about this? So, here is, to me, the fundamental critique about any theology that has any commitments to establishing the kingdom of God. In the book of Acts, chapter 1, Jesus is with the disciples. They meet with him and they ask him, and it's the kind of thing you would ask if you've been hanging around with the resurrected Jesus for 40 days. They ask, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel at this time? And Jesus says, sorry, can't tell you. In other words, it's not for you to know. And here's the point. If they don't know, one, not that anyone's doing this in these movements, but nobody would be writing books predicting about when Jesus comes back. This seems to happen at least every decade. But nor would you think that it is your responsibility to be trying to establish the kingdom before he comes back. He said, you can't know. He says, I can't tell you that, but you'll receive power and you'll be my witnesses. All right, so he tells them that they're going to be witnesses. Is he telling them, and because the power of the Spirit is going to come upon you, now when you feel the power, take Rome? Right? I mean, that was not at all what they were thinking. It was an impossibility. And so it's interesting to me that there's any theology that suggests that we should know, or that of course it's our responsibility to make the kingdom happen. Now, it's certainly true that we have what I would call a commitment to and a responsibility to, I like to say, reflect the kingdom, display the kingdom, or really imperfectly display the kingdom because we're imperfect people, but that our actions give some sense of, we can create an anticipation about what might be coming, like an aroma of what's coming, but not actively be trying to establish the kingdom. And so, to me, this language from Jesus itself is reason to say, whatever aspirations people have, however they're thinking about our language of mission, it can't be kingdom establishing a kingdom establishing mission. Because if Jesus told them, right in front of them, yes, you have a mission, but nothing's going down in terms of the kingdom being fully established till I show up. And you can't find, and you don't know when that is. And he doesn't tell them, and do certain things, and then here's the calculus, and then I'll be back. That's not what he tells them. That's my first critique. Here's another one, particularly about Christian nationalism in the United States. It's not only the United States, but it's particularly the United States, because some of the discourse among some Christian nationalists, you would think that the United States is a country that God particularly established, made a covenant with the United States, and that we are kind of a new Israel. To which I say the following. There is no mention of any country on this side of the Atlantic in the Bible. The most you're going to get is the ends of the earth or the nations. That's all you got. So there's no language there, right? So we're mentioned as the nations, but we're not this specific nation. Now, does that mean that, hey, never talk about American exceptionalism? I'm not saying that, but American exceptionalism is not a reason to conclude that, hey, we are the special nation. There's a lot of unique things that have happened in the United States. We're a country where you would have all these Christian religions together, and they agree not to kill each other. And we agree not to establish a church. So we're not like England, we're not like Germany, we're not like the Netherlands, etc. You don't have an official denomination, and you allow that freedom of expression. Huge. And certainly there are things that have happened in terms of human liberty with an asterisk, that, at least in terms of aspiration and in terms of discourse, that have been part of the brand, if you will, of the United States of America. But here's another reason, just to keep in mind about some of the language that people talk about wanting to bring it back, or to talk about us as if we are a unique Christian nation. If we were a nation with a covenant, why are we even still here because of slavery, Jim Crow, and the genocide of Native Americans? I mean, we should be glad that God is long on mercy, if that's what we're thinking. Active dehumanization of people, image bearers, right? And sometimes using Scripture to excuse it. That's problematic. And so that, I think, is part of the problem. Here's part of the better way in terms of thinking about some of the theological commitments. It's true, and I think it's implicit in Christian nationalism, but it winds up being through a distortion field. God's always been committed to his world. He's never abandoned it. He's never abandoned it. Even when in the language about the fall, I always tell my students, it introduces complication and not futility. Right? Childbirth goes on, you still get fruitfulness that happens. Humans still have responsibility and opportunity to do things in this world. After the flood, God explicitly states a commitment to the preservation of his world. Right? I'm going to put my bow in the sky. So he's committed to the world. That's good. That commitment's ultimately expressed in Jesus, identifying with humanity, coming as our Savior. He's clearly a king, but he is not a king giving us a command for advancing and taking over the world. And, parenthesis, and when Christians have tried to do that, it hasn't worked out so well. Right? It's the record. Now, have Christians done lots of good things? They have, tons of good things. But there's been no nation where people have tried to, okay, we're going to be the perfect Christian nation, where eventually you didn't get the same thing that happens when kind of making a 1960s reference here, when if you think about a hippie commune where everybody shares everything, and we're committed, and we're going to be peaceful, and we're going to be just this one alternative community, until somebody decides, I don't want to actually for us to share all of that we earned, so I'm going to give part of what I earned. Or something always happens that makes the utopia go south, right? Same thing with aspirations towards making nations Christian. In fact, I think one of the things that it forgets, and this is, the Reformed tradition's really good. We're not the only ones, but we're really good at talking about depravity. Now, not depravity to the extent that there's no belief in sanctification as a process. But the view of depravity does remind you that sanctification is a process. In other words, you may have proceeded here in terms of sanctification, but then you discover that there's a vista you didn't know about here in terms of your need for sanctification. This is the way it goes. And my point is that when you have a bunch of human beings who are like that, it's really hard to perfectly establish a nation. And I mean, even for the Christians that happen to be the ones that are able to do politics and have political responsibility, because just being Christian doesn't give you the competence to run a country. Sometimes with the way that some people talk, you would think that that's what, if we just got the Christians in charge, then everything would work out. It's like, that is not a guarantee. That is not a guarantee. Now, so close parenthesis, some of that. So what also remains for us, and certainly it's again, I think it's a distortion in Seven Mountains especially, what I call the first Great Commission remains for us. Genesis 1, but also echoed in Psalm 8. When God creates humans and he gives them responsibility for dominion over the world, it's really important to understand that dominion is not about a kind of powerful domination of the world. It is about stewardship of the world. It is God giving humans responsibility to manage all of this. Dominion doesn't mean, because sometimes dominion really does have negative connotations. Dominion doesn't mean, how can I do my worst? No, dominion really means, how do I manage this well? All right, and how do I manage this well, knowing that it's God's world, not mine? And I have to answer to him. That commission remains. Part of the reason that that commission remains is because of a doctrine called common grace. And here's where I'll talk about my dissertation figure, Abraham Kuyper, a little bit, because he's the one that introduced it to me. Common grace, really every tradition has some version of it, whether they call it common grace or not. Common grace is a way of talking about the fact that the world goes on even though the fall has happened. And so what we need with common grace then, or what we get with common grace, is God preserving the world so that we can still obey what I call this first Great Commission, because managing the world is a Great Commission. That's why I call it the first Great Commission. And it's echoed in Psalm 8, just being in awe of the fact that God gives us this responsibility. Right? If the fall got rid of it, why would the psalmist be talking about it? And so God preserves the world. God gives lots of generosity to the world. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. He gives talents to people who are his covenant people and talents to people who don't have anything to do with him. And God doesn't have to do that. That's why it's called common grace. All right, so common grace makes it possible for us to continue to do this stewarding of the world. So that remains for us. And in doing that, we should be participating in all the domains of the world. And Kuyper, 1837 to 1920, Prime Minister of the Netherlands from 1901 to 1905, wrote a lot, and definitely imperfect. We can have that conversation at another time. But he articulated a view of the spheres, this idea called sphere sovereignty, and he has a very famous quote that has been very much misused by some people. When he talks about what's called sphere sovereignty, he's talking about that God's sovereign over everything, over the world, and then each social domain, so we're talking about church, business, education, law, etc. Each of those is distinct, and there's sovereignty within each sphere, which means each one has its distinctiveness. In other words, you don't try to do education like you're doing a church, or you don't try to do government like you're doing athletics or something, right? So you have those spheres that are distinct. They have their own integrity, and Christians should participate in them. And the fact that they are Christian leads to how they ought to try to bring some sense of Christian influence to those. And the point is, of course, that people who are made alive by God are stewarding the opportunities of common grace. Now, I mentioned a quote because it's fundamental to why Kuyper is saying that we ought to be in these spheres. He says, there's not one square inch over the entire creation over which Jesus Christ, who is Lord over all, does not say mine. Some people completely misinterpret that. They think because he said there's one square inch and it's mine, oh, he said it's mine. That must mean it's ours. That's not what he said. His point was, if every square inch is his, we ought to be participating in it because it's his, not taking over it because it's his. And this is really important in terms of Abraham Kuyper. Abraham Kuyper was the leader of a minority movement in the Netherlands. The only way he becomes prime minister is by a coalition with other Christian parties, including a Catholic party. He was a large personality. But even he knew with his large personality that he never was going to be running everything. And so for people to interpret that is to be, how should we say, creatively interpreting it or advantageously interpreting it. But that's not what he meant. The point is, yes, the world belongs to God, and because it belongs to God, his people ought to be participating in that world. Which means that we should be doing that. And so common grace makes it possible for us to do that. And when we're doing that participation, we're doing it for the good of the world. We're doing it for the good of our neighbors. I sometimes like to think about the language in Romans 13 as kind of something they always keep in mind when we're talking about our participation in the world. Because in the world, not everybody is like us. People are different from us for all kinds of reasons, right? The family you come from, your racial ethnic background, your social class, your language, all kinds of things. And certainly religion. And there's no asterisk beside the word neighbor. And in Romans 13:10, after Paul says that every horizontal command is basically summed up in love your neighbor as yourself, he then says, love does no harm to a neighbor. What happens when love does no harm to a neighbor is your baseline? It's like a mantra that's in your head all the time. That doesn't mean it's always easy to figure out how to do that. Let's just use something that people are thinking about a lot these days as an example: deportation. So here's the thing. There are people here who are undocumented. And if they're undocumented and they're not supposed to be here, then deportation per se is not a bad thing. But the fact of doing deportation doesn't mean that you should do it any way you want to do it. What's a humane way of doing that? And to me, sometimes I imagine something like saying, listen, I know there's all kinds of circumstances why you're here. And you have to go. But telling someone they have to go doesn't mean, now I will call you names. Now I will treat you with hostility. There may need to be, in some cases, force. Force doesn't require hostility. And certainly for the Christian who is thinking about love does no harm to a neighbor, how am I treating you like you are a person with fundamental dignity because you are an image bearer and you are a neighbor? There's no asterisk beside neighbor. You can't be, except for the people that aren't on my team. There's no exception clause when it comes to neighbor. And so I think one of the most important things for us to be thinking about is in our participation in the world and in our engagement in the various spheres of life, our relationships with others, which aren't always easy things, we ought to be seeking and discerning how to be as neighborly as possible, no matter what our commitments to justice are. A commitment to justice does not mean that I get an out on neighborliness. And so I think that's one of the biggest things for us to consider. This is the last thing I want to say, then I have a quote to wrap it with. However we are going about our politics and our engagement in other spheres of life, one of the opportunities that we have because of common grace, participating in God's world, is to be engaged in these domains. But it's also important for us to remember that because of our own limitations, our need for sanctification includes our minds. Nobody has a completely sanctified mind and nobody's omniscient. Everybody's missing something. And because of that, whatever I propose in terms of society and culture, it's a grand experimental enterprise. And in that grand experimental enterprise, that takes the pressure off of establishing. Right? Instead, I'm thinking about the opportunity to try something, to imagine something, and say, what if we tried this? Public policy or what have you. And so our pursuit of the good is really a big, holy experiment. But we have that opportunity because God does allow us this ongoing possibility with this first Great Commission to serve him in this world. And serving the world is a lot different than trying to take over the world. Here's what Kuyper said about Christian nation. Terms such as a Christian nation, a Christian country, a Christian society, Christian art, and the like do not mean that such a nation consists mainly of regenerate Christian persons, or that such a society has already been transposed into the kingdom of heaven. This was never the case anywhere. Even in Israel, the great majority was apostate and idolatrous, and the faithful always a rather small minority. No, it means that in such a country, special grace in the church and among believers exerted so strong a formative influence on common grace that common grace thereby gained its highest development. The adjective Christian, therefore, says nothing about the spiritual state of the inhabitants of such a country, but only witnesses to the fact that public opinion, the general mindset, the ruling ideas, the moral norms, the laws and customs there clearly betoken the influence of the Christian faith. Though this is attributable to special grace, it is manifested on the terrain of common grace. In other words, in ordinary civil life. This influence leads to the abolition of slavery in the laws and life of a country, to the improved position of women, to the maintenance of public virtue. Now remember, this is the 19th century. Respect for the Sabbath, compassion to the poor, and even in manners, the elevation of all that is human from its sunken state to a higher standpoint. His point is that, yes, influence, but this is an influence that really leads to good for all. It doesn't mean taking over. It doesn't mean that you're even expecting most of the people to be Christian. But it does mean that your influence can make a difference. And this is something I think we need to keep in mind, perhaps especially in all the tension and dissension that's around us. We are not without agency. We still have the opportunity, possibility, and responsibility to serve God in his world and to bring good even in very local ways. It's important for us to not let, the actions of Christian nationalists or of other actions that people are performing lead us to think that there's nothing I can do. Right? Don't just think about what's out there. Think about what's local to you, if nothing else. We still have that opportunity. And so I'd like to encourage us to take that and to think about how we can serve the world and show people a better way of Christian influence. Thank you.
Okay, let me explain how we're going to proceed with some questions and then engagement with Vince. Many of you probably have questions. If you do, raise your hand so that we can see who you are, and we will get you a slip of paper that you can write your question on. And we will collect those and begin to process those after about a 15-minute break, so at the bottom of the hour. I'm going to ask a first question for Vince to think about over the break. We're not going to answer it now. And my question regards Christian nationalism. We used to hear a lot about white Christian nationalism, and we've gotten a little bit more sophisticated and realized, well, it's not only white people who are engaged in Christian nationalism, in particular Cheon, who's Korean, and some others. But most of the names that you mention, most of the faces we see are white. And to kind of put that together with all of the deportation and immigration crackdown, it seems that there is a disproportionate amount of people of color who are being targeted with this. And so I'd like to know what your perspective on that is, and what's the cause of the predominant still lack of pigmentation in the people who are espousing Christian nationalism. So we're going to try to keep these questions, I'm going to try to do justice to them, and but we're going to ask Vince to kind of proceed through. So first, some really quick ones. Who is Paula White? Explain who she is. That's the No,
I think camera. Sorry. Paula White is the head of the White House's Faith Council. She's also the pastor of a church in the Orlando area. She used to be co-pastor of a church called Church Without Walls. So she's been a kind of what people call independent network charismatic type of personality, like having like her own TV show. She even at one point had like her own magazine, kind of like Oprah's magazine, that kind of stuff. But she is she's a charismatic, definitely kind of Christian nationalist person. Here's the interesting thing about it. I always tell people, if you say, close your eyes and think of an evangelical, even, well, this is 2026, even 11 years ago, people are not going to say Paula White.
And now she's the president's personal pastor.
Exactly, yeah. And it's also interesting, by the way, nobody's talking about Robert Jeffress, pastor of First Baptist Dallas, because he was kind of one of the first people supporting the... I'm sure he probably still does, but he's like, I don't even hear anything about him, because you mainly hear about, she's like the face.
Okay, thanks. Please clarify who was polled regarding the views that the United States is a Christian nation. Was it Americans?
Yes.
Or Christian Americans?
No, it's Americans in general.
Okay, so are the 67% who are skeptics or rejectors self-identified Christians or just Americans?
I don't recall from looking at that data.
It was nationally representative.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Thank you.
Okay, while the United States is seen as a highly religious country in terms of practice, compared, for example, to Europe, it is also ignorant of basic knowledge around religion, including theology. Data shows this. To what extent do you think this cultural ignorance of religion contributes to allow more extremist views to flourish?
I think what allows extremist views to flourish is not just a poor lack of theological formation, but I think it tells you about ways that people are responding to, in the United States at least, a fear about an expectation of the American dream that they think is in danger. And if you fuse that with also the idea that America is supposed to be this kind of Christian nation, land of opportunity, and now, okay, well, we're losing all these things that would make my life a certain kind of American life possible. Those types of things drive people to need greater certainty in some cases. And sometimes I think that need for certainty drives people to that. And then, of course, sometimes, some people are just inclined to conspiratorial types of things.
Yeah, you said a lot with that.
Yeah.
What recommendations do you have for the PCUSA and pastors to act or speak up for neighborly love at this particular time?
Well, first of all, I would say encourage people to practice out of their gifts and disposition. The reason I say that is some people are born activists, right? So encourage the activists, but the activists also need to know that everybody's not an activist. So everybody's not going to be out protesting, etc. Some people, there's a protest, they're the first one there. Just as in 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, there's all kinds of gifts in the body. Encourage people to be using their gifts and abilities to practice neighbor love, to look for local opportunities to serve. And that can certainly include ways of thinking about speaking up if you're concerned about ICE and those types of things. But that's not but I would say also look for other ways to seek the good for people.
Such as?
Well, if there are people in your congregation that were government workers that lost their jobs, how are you finding ways to help those people? There's a lot of people. In fact, I was talking to someone last night. Here's a kind of unknown thing. Perhaps disproportionately, a lot of African Americans are government workers, have been government workers. So disproportionately, there's a significant number of people. I even think about some of my relatives growing up. A lot of people work for the government, and a lot of those people don't have jobs now. And so, can you find ways to support those people? And so, learning about that and finding ways to serve that, I think, would be really an important thing because a lot of that is unseen.
Thank you. So why do you think guns and other violent behaviors and manners seem to be associated with Christian nationalism more than they do with liberal or progressive Protestantism, and when Jesus was peaceful himself?
Sure. Because I think there are a lot of people have a romantic notion of the United States, and that romantic notion of the United States is kind of, it's become hardwired into them, and because and it disinclines people to think about, hey, my freedom is important. In other words, that it's so reflexive that the idea of impinging upon freedoms is it's heretical, and I think it's not particularly clear to those people that they should that being peaceful, at least for some of them, should not mean like accumulating like an entire arsenal, right? It winds up becoming an identity for some people, and that part of their identity, sometimes they're having their faith sponsor that rather than having their faith interrogate that.
Yeah, I recently heard a report that there are now gun ranges for those who are particularly left-leaning and who are of a different ideological perspective, in part because of their fear of what might happen, and they want to be able to do that.
I think that is, I can understand why people would have that. I don't think that at a gun range that people are, just because you don't share their political persuasion, that they're going to just direct their violence toward you. I think the froth, if you will, of all the dissent and fear can lead people to feel like I need that. So I'm not saying that's bad. to have that, but I think a lot of the people that have those guns, I mean, I don't think they're all looking to go around, I think, again, some people, it's because of their fixation of freedom, and for some of them, it's freedom combined with an irrational fear because they've never really gotten out much to meet people that aren't like them.
Wow. Can you say a little bit more about this quotation, force does not require hostility? The person thinks it's super interesting, especially in light of those who live by the sword will die by the sword.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not a pacifist, so I'm not doing Yoder and Hauerwas here. John Howard Yoder, controversial figure, but there's no Stanley Hauerwas without John Howard Yoder. But what I mean is that, I mean, sometimes when people are undocumented and people are coming to enforce the deportation, they make a run for it. Or sometimes they're, acting in terms of force. So you have to be able to exercise force and de-escalate that situation. But that doesn't mean that you need to have almost like what I would call the kind of performative cruelty that I think we're seeing a lot of right now. Almost like when you got commercials about deportation, I just think that's just, hey, look, leave now and maybe you'll come back. If you don't leave, you'll get no chance. I'm thinking to myself, you're just really stoking within people xenophobia. And of course, particularly in a country that comes out of immigrants. But,
well, I'm wondering who's actually watching those commercials.
Well, I do. Those commercials show up all over the place. TV, they show up online. It's frustrating.
One of the new centers of interest in Christian nationalism, this person observes, is the high-tech world, especially Peter Thiel.
Oh, yeah, sure.
What do you make of this and its possible impact? And say a little bit about who Peter Thiel is.
Peter Thiel is a billionaire investor, very tech-forward, futurist type person. He's a great example of somebody, he's not stupid, he's a smart guy. He's using some version of Christianity talking about that in relationship to the future, but there's definitely, if you will, a boutique dimension to some of his approach to Christianity. That's a nice way of saying inventive. But he is a person who he's tries to think like a captain of industry. And he's one of these people who's kind of trying to think like a futurist, saying, how are we going to keep driving innovation and taking the world where it needs to go? And so part of it, I think, sometimes people they get all this money and they're able to do all these things and they think about not just how much money can I make, but what should the world be like? And so then people start sharing what they think the world should be like. To me, he is. Put it this way, I'm not sure he's following anybody's lead. I think he kind of creates his own vision of things, and now he's sharing it. And certainly, there've been articles about people talking about, okay, now God is in Silicon Valley because people say that Silicon Valley was a godless place. Or not say godless per se, but a place where if you were a Christian, you kind of looked down upon. And now here's Peter Thiel talking about being a Christian. And I'm like, well, yeah, sort of. So he also interesting interview with Ross Douthat. You'll see what I mean by the interesting Christian ideas.
And is that part of the sphere or dominion of technology being taken? Do people see it that way?
I don't know if they do. I think. I think it just fits into however people are thinking about the advance of tech itself. And like if you hear someone like him talk, they have these ideas about, the world moving forward. It's not moving forward like it hasn't moved forward as it should in the last 20 years, and we're trying to figure out how it should.
Okay. What about Roman Catholics? Are Catholic integralists and post-liberals also or can
That's-
they be,
yes.
Christian nationalists? What's the relationship there?
I'm glad you asked. Because
Well, thank you, whoever it was.
I'm glad you asked. I mean, I probably paid that person. Because... Oh, it was Larry. Okay. All right. So, yes, I'm paying Larry. Yes. That was the other. I said I was going to mention one group that is small but noisy. That's the integralists, because they're not that big. But they're post-liberal in terms of post-liberal order, not like liberal or conservative. What we call liberal or conservative is all what we call political liberalism, which is about the liberty of the person. And there are people who think that's a failed project. If you're a Catholic integralist, you want society to be run according to Catholic social teaching. So integralists would not be playing nice with Doug Wilson, and they would not be playing nice with New Apostolic Reformation people. Why? Because they want Catholic social teaching to run society. So they're not interested in sharing.
And so, hypothetically,
Yes.
a Roman Catholic vice president who attends a Right to Life rally, is that a Christian integralist?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Not at all. In fact, it's so small. There are a lot of very conservative Catholics that absolutely are not integralists. Again, I think you just had some very some people that have written a lot. You've got websites about it, but it's really small.
Okay. Not exactly sure if I've got this question interpreted correctly, but can a dominionist movement exist within a democratic republic nation?
I mean, it can, because we allow all kinds of things. But if it achieves its aims, can you have a republic? It depends on which ones you talk to.
Okay.
Because some of them, I think they do want a kind of king type of situation.
So you mentioned earlier about needing to just meet some people who are different than
Yes.
you. And so I have two questions here along those lines.
Yes.
Let's say I end up with an opportunity, maybe it's casual conversation, with someone who seems to have Christian nationalist ideas. What might we clearly and quickly say, what point might we make that this person would receive and think about it, rather than picking an argument with them?
Yeah. I would ask them, what is their hope for the world? Just to let them talk, right? To see, because that's going to tell you really where they want to go. And then I would ask them, what concerns you the most right now?
What are you afraid of?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Although I would probably say concerns, because if you say afraid, I want to say afraid. I would say, so what's your fear? I mean, it's what I want to say. Yeah. But what concerns you, I think they're more likely to go through the door and answer the question. Yeah.
Okay. Does Reformed theology have a particular usefulness in pointing out the problems and contradictions in Christian nationalism? For example, always returning and limits on always reforming or being reformed, and limits on human capabilities.
I think so, but I think it's kind of walking the line between what I would call realism and optimism, because the always reforming part means that we know. I mean, and really, this is just Protestantism 101 in a way, right? Is that we know that we're always checking what we're producing in terms of tradition and the way we're going about our lives against what God's revealed to us. And so if we the Protestant principle is scripture over tradition, and if that's what we're doing, then we're always willing to say, how can I, what am I missing? What are my blind spots? How do I have in some cases, times a better view of this, a bigger view of this? And so that if we are forming people to have that inclination, yes. In terms of human limits, I think reminding people of human limits is not a way to suppress people, but really to tell people, look, you've got opportunities, but you don't need to be messianic. And so encouraging people while also saying, but, you know, Jesus has saved the world. You don't need to be a Messiah. Because sometimes people think, I've got to do it all. And it's like, trust me, you can't. Right?
Yeah.
So I think the important limitation is important. Encouraging people to say, look, you've got your, Ephesians 2:10, God has works for all of us to do. You got works for you. Your works aren't somebody else's works. You don't need to do everybody's works. So what does God have for you? So are you seeking God to discern that? And encouraging people to discern that and also recognize that that's already a limitation because you don't have everybody's job to do. But also then in the midst of that, there's still your own growth as a person who, because there's always another vista ahead of us in terms of growth if we're willing to look for those vistas.
Yeah. So this one is a historical question, or one with a historical context. And more than one voice has compared our current situation today in the United States with some of the similar kinds of movements in 1930s Germany.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
Now, and in 1930s Germany, there was a confessing church that responded, including writing the Barmen Declaration, which is in our PCUSA Book of Confessions.
Yes.
And it rose up to resist the Nazi racism and the Gestapo-like deportation that was taking place in Germany.
Right.
You might want to say a little bit more about some of the historical background and how does that compare and what lessons could we take from that?
Sure. So the confessing church emerged because the state church, which was a Lutheran church in Germany, was basically, I don't know if bought off is the way to put it, but their silence was established, if you will. I mean, not violently, but
They were certainly co-opted.
Yeah, by the Third Reich. So the confessing church were people that wanted to oppose that, and particularly because they were opposing, you've got this grand vision of this nation rising to take over everything. And so the tricky thing about the confessing church is that, yes, the confessing church was there, but Hitler didn't really care. He kept doing what he was doing, right? So I think if we're talking about in terms of a commitment to faithfulness, the confessing church is really helpful in that sense. It's trickier because of the level of totalitarian action that was there. The difference that we have is we're in a multi-denominational country. We don't have a state church, and there are, even with the disturbing things that are happening, I think one of the things to point out is, yes, those disturbing things are happening. I think there's reason for that concern. But I think, how should I put it? We still now have more agency than they had. And also, even with the things that are happening right now, it's not exactly people say this is like the fascist playbook, etc. I mean, maybe to a certain degree, but in some ways, it's very subject to what I would call the whims of the person in the White House, and so that it makes it in some ways less predictable.
Okay. If Christian nationalism continues to gain ground and power in our government, is there an implication or a tipping point for those who are currently involved in working in government service about how appropriate or moral or witness-bearing it is to stay in such a position of service in our government?
It's a great question, to which I would say it depends on where you are. And depends upon your person, and it depends upon your personal calling. Some people, you need to be the person that's there even when, you feel like you're, in acid rain or something. There are other people, it's like, no, probably the best thing for you to do is to move on. And so it's really case by case. But I'm not convinced that Christian nationalism is showing up like in all those particular places. Because there are a lot of people, I mean, a lot of the people that we're seeing doing something, they're not necessarily presenting themselves as Christian nationalists. Maybe Mike Johnson, Pete Hegseth, people like that might fit that. But a lot of these other people, I'm not sure what they think or what they believe in terms of religion.
I'd be curious here in the room, how many people are currently involved in serving in some wing or part of the government? Raise your hand. So how many are retired or formerly worked in such, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's always interesting. It's always more than I think it's going to be.
Yeah.
So in the 19th century, Protestants, including Presbyterians, built institutions to reshape the family and to develop congregational life and also education, the media, voluntary societies. In what ways are these similar to and different from Christian dominionists?
That's a great question. I don't think that dominionists have built that many things. Now, Doug Wilson has like a publishing house. They have this new St. Andrews University and school. But not all of them have that scale of institutions. And here's an interesting thing I didn't mention. I think it's important. And it's not just with New Apostolic Reformation, it's even with like different Reconstructionists and Dominionists. They don't all play nice with each other. There's an article that somebody wrote once in Harper's about being at the National Religious Broadcasters. And there were a lot of people talking about big ideas, and they were talking about a fear that if these people took over, then who's going to be next, etc. What I was thinking about the author of that article is that I don't think you know about the egos at that conference. Because a lot of people, they are not interested in sharing power. They're like, Pat Robertson was not interested in saying, hey, James Dobson, why don't we share? Right? These people are they have their own empires. And so, and also in terms specifically with Christian Reconstruction, this is one example. R.J. Rushdoony's son-in-law was a guy named Gary North, also a theonomist, Christian Reconstructionist.
So Rushdoony and North are Reconstructionists.
Yeah, absolutely. Rushdoony's deceased now, but North is still around. But they didn't get along at all. They certainly had some different ways of seeing things, but they didn't get along. And so they were... And so I think it's important for us to understand that sometimes in these families, they've got disputes. And so they're not... The kind of coming together in a kind of army is a tricky thing because sometimes people can't get over themselves.
Okay, this person observes this. With a few exceptions, Christian nationalists are just activist Christians, and the criticism of Christian nationalism is only one of many criticisms by liberally oriented, that liberals aim at conservatives. What comments do you have about that?
That is sometimes true, but that goes in both directions. Because the problem is the temptation to giving the ultimate summation of what something is. All right, so even when people are saying, well, it's this Seven Mountains thing, I'm like, well, which part are you talking about? And who are you talking about? You've got to ask those questions. Because sometimes it's like, well, with those people, you're absolutely right. Other people, it's like, no, that's not what they're doing. So I think there are definitely people that that deserve the criticism. Other people, honestly, they're just trying to sort out that, hey, I care about Christian faith. I care about Christian faith showing up. I'd like to not be criticized because I mention it. Or that the presumption of mentioning it means that I want to take over. Right? Are there people that want to take over, and if they take over, they want to throw people that don't agree with them in prison? Oh, I'm sure they're out there. But there are other people, they just want Christians to be able to be Christian without having to be closeted about it. And in their domains, in fact, I'll give you an example. The person I had dinner with last night, he worked on Capitol Hill, and he was talking about the people that he worked with, and he was, when he was a staffer, it was a Friday night, they were going to go somewhere, and he's with these Irish Catholics, though, who are really more like secular Catholics, almost like Catholic non-practicing types, and they were going to go meet up somewhere. He goes, okay, I'll meet up with you guys, because I've got like a church thing. And the guy looked at him like, church thing. Didn't he just say, oh, that's right, because you're Southern, he said. The point being that there are a lot of people who inhabit certain domains, they really don't think that people actually really take religion seriously. And for them, for someone to take it seriously, and then for that to have something to do with informing government, it must be a bad thing.
So it reminds me, your response reminds me of an op-ed piece I read maybe 3 weeks ago in the New York Times by Molly Worthen, who is a historian at the University of North Carolina and has recently written a book about charisma and charismatics. Do you recall the specifics of that article, and would you want to say anything about it?
Well, interesting thing about Molly Worthen is she's a person who, through a very long, slow process, became a Christian in the last couple of years. And so in the book, when she's talking about charisma, she's not just talking about the charismatic movement. She's talking about sort of like the use of charisma in terms of like leadership. I'm trying to remember what, because she came and lectured about it at Wheaton.
But the op-ed piece was specifically about Christians who, I think one of her comments was, 25 years ago, most Christians would have said these kinds of things, that they wanted to have a positive influence on the culture, and did they want everybody to know Jesus? Well, yeah, but
well, here's the interesting thing about the Ryan Burge data about 2007. I mean, you had people that are liberal that said that the Christian values should make a difference. The question is, which Christian values are people talking about?
Okay.
So which Christians are people talking about? And then by virtue of that, depending upon if they're not your team, then how do you talk about the people that are not on your team? Right? And sometimes people are like, well, I don't like what that team's talking about. And so, but it doesn't mean that, and so they'll go, those Christian values people, it's like, well, yeah, you care about Christian values too. You mean their Christian values. So people need to be more specific about that. But of course, that's kind of complicated in public discourse.
Yes. So this is a bit of a complex question. I'll try to interpret it as best I can. It sounds like those who are actually driven by Christian nationalism and Christian nationalist ideology, they're small in number, but that there is a piece of, or something of sympathizers, or a group that amplify their voice and their influence. And this person imagines that the sympathizers fall into two camps: those who recognize this trend as a way to gain support or power for their particular political agenda, or those who genuinely are trying to be good Christians. But who have been caught in some type of misinformation or conflation, or conflated their conservative identity with their Christian identity. Can you speak to the differing approaches and the differing priorities that we should have toward these two such groups as Christians?
So here's one of the ways to put it. I'll use a certain term that used to mean one thing and has having a public relations problem now. That term is the word evangelical. If it's 40 years ago, even 30 years ago, evangelical basically means these people who take the Bible very seriously, who talk about conversion, personal relationship with Jesus, that type of thing. And even into the 90s, there was dispute about whether or not you should be politically involved if you're an evangelical. By the late 90s, that changes. people begin to largely talk about evangelicals as a political identity in terms of the media. Arguably after George W. Bush gets elected, because he has a bunch of evangelicals in the White House, Mike Gerson's writing, his speechwriter, etc. It still kind of meant the Bible people, but one, it was starting to mean not just a certain group of Protestants, but it also began to mean people who voted a particular way. And at some point, there are people who started calling themselves evangelicals, don't go to church, don't know the Bible very well, but kind of want to be good, they kind of want to be a certain kind of view of America with Jesus sprinkled on it. And that's Bacote language there. But the point being is that, so when you're talking about people that call themselves evangelical that want to care about the country, some of them are the people that still go to church and all these other things, and they care about, and they have differing degrees of being kind of politically conservative. Other people, they're kind of populist and kind of conservative. Especially now, it's hard to tell if they're just populist or conservative. But they are not particularly moral. They're not particularly interested in like the Bible. I mean, but they like Jesus, or at least a version of Jesus that kind of sponsors what they think is the United States of America, or what they want the United States of America to be. The point being is that you have those. I'm using that as an example of kind of some people are really churchgoers, other people aren't, and sometimes there are overlapping concerns, but often sometimes common fears. Sometimes the fears are just, am I being ignored? Other times, people are being told, I mean, both sides do this, but they're hearing apocalyptic narratives that, hey, if this person gets elected, here comes over the hill these marauders. And guess what? It's over. And then, of course, other people, I mean, everybody hears that. I think the funny thing about this is that if people asked African Americans about, okay, what do you think about people using apocalyptic things politically? They would go, well, we kind of lived the apocalypse. And so, and people even, now there's all kinds of debates among African Americans about this, but the point is that we've seen things actually get better. Now, some people might go, things are kind of going back or whatever. There are things that are very frustrating to me right now, but that's no surprise, especially if you know that some people are always going to push against, things that are better for everyone and try to advantage themselves. That's not a reason to be hopeless. But hopelessness and fear are great things to cultivate in people if you want to get certain ends accomplished. And I think that there are people, there's overlapping discourse of that kind of infantilizes their hope and magnifies their fear.
Infantilizes their hopes? Is that what you said?
Yes, yep. Yes. In other words, it's interesting to me that any evangelical would ever think apocalyptically about what's going on historically in sociopolitically anywhere. It's like, you say you believe everything this Bible says, which includes the resurrection, which means you believe that God can conquer death. Now, I think if God can conquer death, whatever's going down socially, I think God can handle it. But you're acting like he can't. And so I think that kind of fear, as if, I just don't know what's going to happen to us. It's like, why don't you look at some history? Because there have been Christians who've been through some things. And they've suffered, but they've come through.
Yeah. So this dovetails very nicely with this next question. This person thinks that a main pillar of the divergent approaches to culture is eschatology, which is certainly a close cousin of apocalypticism.
Yes.
And the conclusion of what action we need to take as a result is influenced by our view on eschatology. So what should we do about that? Should churches spend more time teaching eschatology? And what is eschatology?
I'm so glad you all asked, because on December 31st, I submitted a book about eschatology and ethics after a very long gestation. Probably longer than you think, gestation. That's all I'm going to tell you.
Okay.
So When's it coming out? I don't know, because they haven't gotten back to me about, hey, could you do these revisions? But eventually it's getting there. What's interesting is, I think to a certain degree, whether people think that Jesus is coming back after we set the stage.
So eschatology is?
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Eschata means last, L-O-G-Y, study of. So eschatology means study of last things, right? And so it's basically, how's it going to go down at the end? So studying, things about final resurrection, final judgment, this millennium word about when is there going to be this period of peace, language about new heavens, new earth, all that type of stuff. That's eschatology. And for some people, a lot of the things that are going to happen aren't going to happen until after certainly some nationalists, until we make things happen. So we've got to be active in setting the stage for some of those final events to take place. Other people are saying we're anticipating those events to happen at any minute. And sometimes when those people are saying that, some of them, it becomes a reason for them to pull back from social and political behaviors. Not everybody. There are people who are saying Jesus could have returned at any minute, and they're strangely quite political. But you get more of a catalyst for some people to be active when they have that post-millennial eschatology. But I don't think eschatology, should people teach it more? Yes. If for no reason other than just to remind people, hey, if you think you're living through a horror movie, remember, if you're one of those people who've read horror novels, or if you've been to most horror movies, because not all horror movies end this way, and to most horror movies, the victory goes to the good guys, right? God wins in the end, is the whole point. I mean, but people need to be reminded that God wins in the end, which means if you're a Christian, you win in the end. And I think people need to sometimes have that hope, and also to recognize that God is telling us it's going to work out. That language that Paul tells us at the end of 1 Corinthians 15, be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, because your labor in the Lord is not in vain. It is not in vain. Why? Because the end is coming. God's going to set it all right. Meanwhile, be faithful.
And the book of Revelation begins with God has already won.
Yes.
And he's on the throne.
Exactly.
Okay, this is the last question that I have, and I'm going to have to interpret it.
And then I'll answer your question because I didn't answer yours.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
I guess I could have just like.
So what will it take to get the people who are making our current immigration policies to listen and change the behavior of ICE?
Well, the first thing is probably a Damascus Road experience. Honestly, is what I would like. Seriously, I mean, I think that's all. The part of me, I won't name any names, but I mean, there are definitely people that's like, oh, I wish that there was just the real come to Jesus moment, where it's like, hey, you need to know, right, that what you're doing, right, it's not meeting with approval. Now, failing that, certainly, how should I put this? I mean, God does influence people. So praying for God to influence people is very important. In terms of our own actions, I think certainly communicating, all the way up the chain about our concern. But also I think doing it in ways where where you can be alarmist without, but doing it in a way where you're going to get attention rather than it's like, okay, here's more people just getting attention, but by just the actions. In other words, it was like, oh, I need to stop and pause and think about this. I mean, it's really hard for me to imagine what it will take when there is, to me, cruelty is almost being treated like a virtue. Now, it's selective cruelty. But it's it plays on people's fear. It plays on some people's subterranean, well, not even subterranean in some cases, xenophobia. And I think for some people, they have this idea of, I just want us to, do these things to make our country safer. This is absolutely hilarious to me. It's like, who do you think has committed most of the crimes in this country? Citizens. Most of the crimes, most people that are undocumented are not trying to get attention to themselves by committing crimes. Again, that doesn't mean that you don't need to do, hey, we need to navigate that. But one of the big problems with immigration has been, arguably, and this is one of the challenges of the moment, the lack of political will to actually do something from both parties. And so now you have political will being carried out, but it's being carried out in a way that's like, it's like you could do these things without seeming to make, to have it be all about being mean and hostile and to call people names. And you could do that. But there are a lot of people, they really respond to that. Now, obviously, there are a lot of other people that are clearly responding to what's happening by saying, I don't like this disposition. I don't like the way you're doing these raids. And so, there's all these people convening in Minnesota and other places where you're having, just in recent days. I think in terms of our personal agency, we need to avail ourselves of what we've learned in civics and communicate to our representatives, what we feel about all of this. Now, it's hard to know in this moment how much, whether that can make a difference prior to the midterms, if certain things change in the midterms.
All right, and now
your question.
This question about Christian nationalism,
yes.
white Christian nationalism.
Yes. So first of all, to your point, remember Peter Wagner said that the New Apostolic Reformation was happening because he's thinking about non-white Christians. So he's thinking Africa, Latin America, etc. So there's a lot of Christian nationalism that is non-white, and so you have those kinds of species of it. Now, how much of it are people who are trying to do certain things? The government. May Bolsonaro was trying to do something like that in Brazil. He's in jail now. He lost the election, right? So, but you do see that happening in some other countries. So it is actually more multi-ethnic. But in terms of the deportation, so here's an irony. There are a lot of people that are Christian nationalists, they're Latino. And so, in a way, it's an irony. But here's part of the tricky thing about it. There's really no good term. What is Latino, Hispanic? You're talking about geography, you're talking about language, you're talking about culture. You're basically saying because people generally speak Spanish or Portuguese, they're kind of this group of people. They're massively different in all kinds of ways. And they have their own differences, their own fights with each other, their own prejudices toward each other. And so I think that makes it complicated about, which, is it more Cubans? Is it more Costa Ricans? Is it more Guatemalans? We don't know. But in terms of the demographic, it's just important to note that there's a significant proportion that are non-white, that are Hispanic / Latino, whatever language we use for that. And so I think we have to, we note the irony of the targeting in terms of most of the people that are being deported, combined with the fact that there are people whose ethnicity is in that big category, and some of them are probably cheering it on.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm not, I don't have a schedule in front of me. I'm not sure what happens next. Oh, all right.
All right.
Thank you so much for great questions and for making what happened this morning possible.
I'm Scott Ramsey, pastor at Lewinsville Presbyterian Church in McLean, and one of the folks on the board of the Reformed Institute. And Dr. Bacote, thank you very, very much for this morning. This has been, exceedingly helpful. You've introduced us to, a lot of us, to names and themes that we had not been as aware of as we could be or need to be. You've helped us to think well about these things, and I've experienced that you've modeled for us how to think steadily, well, thoroughly about these things and about our own calling as Reformed Christians. So thank you very, very much. This is the kind of event that the Reformed Institute wants to be able to put forward in our area, and the way we do that is through your financial support, both as individuals and as congregations. If you go to reformedinstitute.org, right at the top of the page there is a yellow donate button, and if you click that, it'll take you to a page. We have several different as one does, levels of support. There is the friend, the patron, the benefactor level. So we would welcome you to do that as individuals. We'd also welcome congregations. A number of congregations in our presbytery are connected to the Reformed Institute as congregational supporters. There are different ways to do that, and we would welcome your questions about how to do that. Also on the reformedinstitute.org page, you'll find a variety of different resources. Earlier, Quinn was mentioning the Company of Teachers, which are a number of folks connected to the Reformed Institute who can be made available to your congregations in different ways. Many of you are in congregations where this has already happened. For Sunday school classes, for evening seminars, and the like. There are also some other resources on the page that you can access, so that we can, as we live as faithfully as we can during the times that we've been given to live in, we want to be a resource to you as you do that. Thank you again for coming out this morning.